Hello and good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first Business Barn webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. To introduce ourselves, my name's Rosie. I'm the business manager at the Business Barn, and Hannah Mole is the guest this evening, or I should say the host rather. Hannah is the director of the Business Barn and Mole & Co, and I will hand you over across to Hannah in a moment. But before we start, I just want to check a few things with you and just explain how the sort of session is going to work. So hopefully you can all hear us okay. On your right-hand panel of your screen, you should have the option to raise your hand. And just so we can check from our end that the sound is working, if all of you could just click that button and just raise your hand, that would be brilliant. And we can just check everything's working. That's brilliant. Everyone seems to be okay, so that's great. Also in that panel, you'll see that there's a drop down for questions. Now, any time during the session, please do feel free to ask your questions whenever they pop into your head. We will keep them till the session and we'll ask Hannah those at the end, but whenever they pop in, do just ask. And the last thing is to say is all the attendees, all of you guys are listening, so any background noise, any children screaming, any cows blaring, whatever, won't be heard. It's just by us or any of the other attendees, so you're absolutely fine. So without further ado, I will pass you across to Hannah to kick off the session.
Hi everyone, thank you Rosie, that's brilliant. So I'm afraid you're all our guinea pigs because this is our first webinar we've ever done, and certainly my first webinar. So so we'll see how smoothly it goes. I was having a think a minute ago just to try and think about how I can make a webinar on planning interesting. Came to the conclusion that no webinar on planning is interesting, and so I thought, well, at least I can just try and make it fairly painless. We'll skip through it fairly quickly, and then obviously if you've got the questions at the end, then I'm more than happy to answer whatever I can. So let's just see if this works. So I thought perhaps just for a moment I would introduce myself. I set up the business Mole & Co 9 years ago. So we are sort of land agents, planning consultants, rural charter surveyors. Over the last few years, we specialised in rural planning, and now sort of 60% of what we do is planning for diversification. We do a huge amount of glamping and things. We work across England and Wales in lots and lots of local authorities. Principally, we're Midlands based, but we do go further afield as well. One of the things that we're quite proud of is we have a really good success rate, and the reason for that is because we don't take on things that we don't think we can win. So we don't take on jobs that we don't think we can be successful with. So we try very hard to get it right, but we are honest about your chances. So if we don't think something is likely to be able to achieve a planning consent, we'll be fairly upfront with you. I know that some of you may be further afield. I'm not sure where you're all from, and some of you, you know, you might not necessarily be able to work with us. But I'm more than happy to point you in the right direction if it's just to get you started or give you some pointers. No obligation, or even if you're local, there's still no obligation. So if it doesn't lead to anything, but please feel free to ask because I'd like to be able to help if we can. So very quickly, we've got a running order, just about 20 minutes now of the things that we sort of discussed we were going to cover, when you do and don't need planning permission and so on, who decides a planning application, how to make a successful planning application, and sort of some likely costs and things. And then, as Rosie said, we shall do some questions at the end. I will skip through it fairly quickly just to try and get through what we need to in 20 minutes. So the first thing is as we set out, do you need planning permission? That's the question. It's the big question. I wanted to just give you a tiny bit of terminology before I go into that question, because it just helps kind of give you a little bit it helps you distinguish it when we go through and talk about various elements. So operational development, this is where you build something. This is something that is attached to the land in some way. You've built something. So the treehouse, for example, that is physically changing the land, or that's attached to it. You've built it into the land. Building a house is operational development. That's the difference between a change of use. So a change of use is not physically changing the land in any way. You are changing the use of it. So an example of that would be something like a shepherd's hut. It's not attached to the ground in any way. You haven't physically changed that ground, but you are no longer using that site for agricultural purposes. You are now using it for, for a shepherd's hut, for tourism purposes. So that is a change of use. Occasionally, a change of use comes along with operational development. For example, in glamping, you might quite often have, say huts or pods or whatever, and then you might have to build a shower block or a toilet or something to go with it. So you might have those two things go hand in hand. Permitted development is a term that you'll hear quite frequently in planning. Permitted development is when there's an overarching grant of permission for something. You'll be familiar with it. Agricultural buildings, for example, have 28 days, 28-day notices. That's permitted development. But with regard to glamping, basically there is very limited, or I can't really think of any examples where permitted development applies. So for the rest of this, we shall forget about permitted development, but I just wanted to mention it as sort of to give you an outline of what it is. So do you need planning permission? So if we're talking about operational development, anything that you build, then pretty much in every situation, you will always need planning permission, even things like small shower and toilet blocks. And we have done planning applications for really piddly little things, which seem ridiculous, but is required. So anything that you build is a yes. In terms of a change of use, if you are doing things we're almost always here talking about commercial or a business. If you wanted to put that shepherd's hut in your garden to use it as a granny annex or something, that's different. So what I'm talking about now is if you're intending to use your shepherd's hut or pods or whatever for a commercial business. So if you want to change the use of some land or a field of an area of land to site shepherd huts, pods, camping, caravans, on the whole, you will need planning permission for that change of use. But occasionally there are some exemptions for the change of use, and I'll just talk to you about those very quickly now. There's something called a certified caravan and camping license. There are certain organisations, exempted organisations. The two most popular and main ones that you'll probably have heard of are the Caravan Club and the Camping and Caravanning Club. Now, if you join and become a member of those, they have basically permission to issue you with a site licence that you don't then have to apply for planning permission for. So they can issue you with a licence, if you're a member and abide by their rules and so on, for up to 5 caravans and up to 10 tents on a site. So you can do that without planning permission, providing that you are a member of one of these exempted organisations. There are a couple of limitations to that. For example, you can't have one caravan there for more than, or any of the caravans can't be there for more than 28 days consecutively. But the member organisations would go through that with you at that time if you were interested. But it is quite a useful thing to be aware, because if you just wanted to go into it in a small way and start off on that basis, you don't need express planning permission. You can get this licence through through some of those organisations. One of the other exemptions is you can do, from a planning point of view, you can do anything you like. You can change the use of your land for up to 28 days per year without the need for planning permission. So if I use the example of, let's say, a festival or something like that, your neighbour holds a festival and you thought you might offer glamping in the next door field over the period of the festival, you could have it for a few days before, during the festival, and a few days afterwards. And as long as that doesn't amount to more than 28 days, you don't need planning permission for that occasion. Similarly, if you'd sort of got pop-up type of things like bell tents or something, and you just wanted to use them for, I don't know, 10 weekends a year, let's say Friday, Saturday, Sunday or something, and that amounts to 21 days, then you wouldn't need planning for that either. So up to 28 days per year, as a general rule, you can use your land for anything else without the express need for planning permission. If you don't fit either of those two exemptions, then we go back into the change of use, and yes, you do need permission. Who decides a planning application? You submit a planning application to your local authority, which is normally the sort of, who you pay your council tax to, so whichever council that is. Generally speaking, most applications are decided by a planning officer at the local council in the planning department. Occasionally, if there are particularly large schemes or contentious schemes, it can go to planning committee, which is where the local councillors decide it. And if it's refused at either of those two things, then you can appeal it. Obviously, you only appeal if you think that the council are wrong. So that's the sort of process that it goes through. What I wanted to talk to you about was, if you are in the position, which I presume most of you are, of thinking about setting up a glamping site, it is in your best interest to give a little bit of consideration to whether you think you will be able to achieve planning before you start making a planning application. So I just wanted to cover with you the sorts of things that are taken into account when a planning officer is determining your application. So the first thing to say is, the first thing a planning officer will do is look at what their local plan says about your proposal. And you can look that up by going onto your local council. You can go into the planning policy section, and somewhere in the depths of the website will be their local plan. And in the local plan, there is almost certainly a section on how they deal. There's a policy on tourism and leisure, or that type of thing. So they will, it will basically say in there how the council feel about and how they feel about leisure and tourism activities. So that will help to tell you as to whether your proposal, your project, is acceptable to the council in principle. So once you've achieved that, so let's say you've read it, yes, broadly speaking, your local council does support leisure and tourism activities, which broadly speaking, most of them do for their economic benefits. You then, a council will look at a principle with sort of three hats on a little bit. There's a number of things, but they look at it, they count sustainability, and when they determine this application, they will think of it from in the economic terms, social and environmental. And so economic, for example, is things like, and glamping is always good for the economy. It brings money into the rural economy. People are coming, self-catering, and they're spending whilst they're staying with you. Social and environmental, probably fairly neutral, but certainly glamping and tourism accommodation always have some good economic benefits. So once you've decided that, is the council going to accept this in principle? Are they going to be looking at this, reasonably favourably? A council will then take into account what's called material considerations, and these are kind of if you say the slightly boring things, but these are the other planning matters. And the onus is on you, the applicant, to make sure that you can demonstrate and explain to the planning officer how you can make these planning matters acceptable to them. So, for example, you can obviously either write those down or have a look at them afterwards. But principally, these are the types of things as a planning consultant or when we're preparing applications that we look at and work through. Is what you're proposing suitable in the location you're proposing it? Is it of a suitable size and scale, or is it too big? What does the design look like? You haven't hopefully painted something with bright pink with yellow spots. In the main, it needs to be something that sits in the surroundings nicely. Who's it going to affect? Residential, the landscape. What's it going to look like in the wider surroundings, and so on. Some of those things don't always come into account. Things like heritage, that would only be relevant if, say, for example, you were proposing it next to on a designated heritage site, or perhaps maybe next to a listed building or something like that. So there are some that won't come into play. So when a planning officer looks at policy and then the material considerations, what they do is they undertake what they call the planning balance. So they effectively look at benefits on one side of this scales versus the harm or impact on the other side of this scales. So all the benefits, which are all the economic things that we know, versus is there going to be any harm or is there going to be any impact by you doing or carrying out your proposal. The good thing about glamping on the whole is that it's relatively small scale, relatively low key, and on the whole, most of these material considerations can be made acceptable. So more often than not, your benefits of the economic development and everything else far outweigh any potential harm or impact. Having said that, there are what I call the 3 deal breakers. Now, these are 3 things. Going back onto the material considerations, a lot of those are negotiable. For example, if the council don't like the design, you can tweak it. If they think the scale is too big, you could reduce it. These 3 deal breakers, it's a yes or a no. And if it's a no, it's very difficult to get your project to go any further. These are 3 things that are basically not overcomable. So the 3 things are flooding, if you're in a flood risk zone. Highways, you have to be able to demonstrate, and this is really important, that you can get safe access to your site, and that's a yes or a no. In terms of designations, there are a few designations. Green belt, if you're in the green belt, that can be really difficult to overcome because basically the starting presumption, if you're in the green belt, is the answer is no. And you've got to be able to demonstrate very special circumstances. So there are a few other designations like AONB, SSSIs and things. At the end, I'm going to tell you how you can look all of those up. So those are the 3 deal breakers. Look at those first. If you come to a stop on any of those 3, don't necessarily spend any money until you've investigated those 3, because those could just scupper a project altogether. So when you make a planning application, you're submitting it to the local authority. This is just a short list of some of the things that you'd be expected to provide. You obviously have to fill out a set of forms. There is block and location plans showing it in different scales as to where your siting is. You'd write a planning statement, which is basically bringing all of these things into a statement and setting that out to the planning officer. Design and access, sometimes you can incorporate that into the planning statement, and that just is what it says, talking about that in more detail. They often want to know about water management, particularly foul drainage, which is a delightful thing to have to go into detail over. But again, sometimes you're in more remote locations. How are you going to deal with the drainage? And that is something that the planning officers will want to know. And then you may need to submit sort of technical supporting surveys, depending on your site and depending what it is you're proposing, which I shall come on to now. Sorry if you can't see that terribly well, it's not a great photo, but in terms of the costs, generally speaking, the smaller and lower key, the less surveys you will have to provide. If you have got an unusual proposal, something a little bit far out there in terms of design, or if it's a large scheme, lots of units, or if it's in a high impact location, something like on the side of a AONB, then you'll probably require additional surveys and have to go to extra lengths to demonstrate to the council that all of those material considerations can be dealt with. So these are just some typical costings for you. I'm afraid all of it is a bit of as, how long is a piece of string? So they're just indicative. The one thing I would say, obviously, is talk. If you do decide to use a planning consultant, talk to them about what it is that you need. There's a bit of an offset in terms of going in with more or less, but you'll be guided. So those are the technical reports. You'll have to pay a planning fee to the council. For a change of use, it's £462. For operational development, it depends on the footprint. So relatively small things are, a few £100s. If you're getting into big schemes, then it could potentially rise quite highly. But that's difficult to tell you because it varies so much. Planning consultants, again, huge range. If you just need a little bit of advice and you need them to write you a covering letter, you could be talking about a few £100s. You're talking about a big scheme where they need to coordinate lots of things closer to the 4,000. A couple of examples for you. This is a very basic one. If you just needed a couple of pods, as I say, you might need a basic ecological survey, planning fee to the council if you decide to use a consultant. If not, you can do it for less than £1,000 probably. Compare that to, let's say, a larger, higher impact type of thing in a designated area. Again, I won't run through it. Some of these you'll need, some of these you won't, but you could spend 5,000 or 6,000 on it on a bigger scheme. I just want, it's very, very how long's a piece of string, but you know, you could do it for less than 1,000. It could cost you 6 or 7. But you know, if you want a budget, you could budget for somewhere in the middle of that. We always do these top tips. Now, the professional advice, obviously, I'm a planning consultant, but I promise you that I'm not just trying to seek extra work here. The thing that a planning consultant can do for you is give you strategic advice. Sometimes you may not always be able to get what you want straight away, and a planning consultant may take you from A to B, but you'll end up at C is where you want to get to. And sometimes that tactical strategic approach actually can make the difference between a successful application and not. The planning consultant will also make that planning statement for you, so they will write all that planning balance and all of that about the weighting and so on. They will do that with their experience of what's important to your local authority. More than one way to skin a cat. Basically, sometimes if you can't necessarily get what you want straight away, sometimes there are other things that you can do first to make it then acceptable when you put in another application. So don't go, our advice generally is don't go to the council and tell them everything and blurt it all out at the start. Take some tactical advice, decide on a strategy, and then sometimes you can approach the council, but sort of get your ducks in a row first. If you've got a bigger scheme and you need to do lots of surveys, then obviously ask, you know, get 2 or 3 quotes for each one. Do your homework, and by that you can do lots of research. All applications are online, so you can look, and I would suggest that you look a couple of things up. So you can go on and you can look for other applications that are similar to yours in your area, and you can look at the planning officer's report. You can look at the approval or refusal notice, and you can look at what other people have submitted by way of additional technical reports and so on. So you can look and see, you could broadly find out what's going to be expected of yours by looking at other people's. Assume that you probably aren't going to get planning permission and then justify it. That way round, I find that you don't take anything for granted and that you put more information into your application. As I said before, principally glamping sites generally the councils like, but if you work on sort of the other basis, and then you are generally on the front foot. Get tactical, and if necessary, get political. What I mean by that is if you have an application which you think might be a little bit contentious or somebody is not going to like it, well, maybe you need to speak to your local parish council or to the local district councillor and get them on side. And lastly, either you or your planning agent should get to know the planning officer and speak to them reasonably regularly through your planning application. Don't just submit it and wait for the notice, wait for the decision notice. Talk to them, ask them if they need any more information, and build a relationship with them, because that will enormously help in a successful outcome. These are just a couple of things. We're on the last slide. A couple of things, places for you to go away and do your research. Magic Maps is an amazing website. Just Google Magic Maps, and on there you can find things like all the listed buildings. You can find green belts. You can find what designated areas you're in. So those deal breakers that we were talking about, are you in any designations? You can get that all on Magic Maps. You can put in your postcode. So jot that one down. Magic Maps is really useful for a lot of things. If you don't know which your local council is or where the site is, there is a finder, a checker, and also then obviously you can then just go and find your local council. And generally speaking, it's on the first page. You can search for planning applications. If you want to find out if you're in a flood zone, you just Google literally that, what I've written down, flood map for planning, and it will come up and you can put your postcode in and it will tell you, and it will give you a nice fancy map. The planning portal, again, Google the planning portal. There's quite a lot of general information on there, which is useful, but also you can find a fee calculator to work out how much it's going to cost you in the application to the council. In terms of other places to find help, like I said, a planning consultant will often give you some free initial advice, so use it and abuse it, and get that strategy first before you apply to the council. So I think that is it, and really just, yeah, any questions, my phone number is on here, my email's on there, and as I said at the start, please feel free to ask any questions. You know, no obligation at all. I just, you know, if I can help, I will. I think that's it, Rosie.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much, Hannah. So there is a couple of questions that will come in, and please do send them in the next couple of minutes and we'll read them out. So there's a couple from Catherine that you could probably answer simultaneously. So the first one is a yurt seen as a tent? And then, does a yurt in someone's residential garden used for Airbnb require the same planning permission as in a field? Is this standard commercial use?
That's a really good question. A yurt tent doesn't really have a planning definition as far as I'm aware. So I would call it, there are things like caravans have definitions. I'm not sure that a tent has a definition. And I'm not sure that you particularly need a definition for it. In terms of whether you need planning, if it's for the purpose of a business, if you have got it on Airbnb with the intent to run it as a business and take a business income from it, even if it's in your garden, then yes, in theory, you should have planning permission for it. I would say that you can have a yurt in your garden if it is incidental to your own house use. For example, you know, if you put Granny out there and she sleeps in it, so you can have that as an incidental use to your own house, and maybe that's what you say if anybody asks. But I think actually if the intent is to run it with a business, then in theory you should have planning.
Brilliant, thank you. Ian has actually given us some sort of helpful hints for other people. So he said that timing can be very critical for ecological surveys if required. They, having recently been granted full planning permission for glamping pods, we were unawares by the positive interest from the local news media. Reporters routinely trawl planning applications, and it would be useful for landowners to prepare press releases, including photographs, in advance to cover positive and potential negative media interest. If the planning application is successful, a well-worded press release can result in good free publicity. So that's probably quite a good point from a sort of PR marketing point of view. If you can get people on your side, then you're onto a winner almost already. Hannah, would you sort of agree with that?
Well, all of that's really, really good, and it's actually I hadn't the media side to it is not something that I thought of. So brilliant that you mention it. The ecological thing is absolutely right as well. That certain surveys have to be done at certain times of the year. So again, you know, I suppose basically give yourself plenty of time. The types of things that are going to be relevant to glamping are the dreaded newts, things like potentially certain, I don't know, maybe certain flora and fauna. Actually, we've just come up with badgers on one as well. And of course, all these various things have life cycles and breeding cycles and everything, and in the case of bats, hibernation cycles. So yeah, so you've got to do them at certain times of the year. So that's a really, really good point. I have got I've got a what's the word, like a timetable list. So if anybody wants that, I can make sure that goes up. I haven't ever put it on, but we can put that onto the Business Barn website so that's available. So we can do that, and that sets out when the survey windows are for all the different species.
Brilliant. No, that'd be brilliant. Another question from Claire, and this is in relation to shepherd's huts. Do you have any idea about composting toilets or eco shower requirements for planning permission? So do those kind of things need planning permission?
You will need to be able to tell the planning officers how you're going to deal with it. What they do is when you submit a planning application, there are a number of what's called statutory consultees that get asked to comment on your application. And one of those generally is sort of either regulatory authorities or there are specialist drainage engineers. And generally speaking, they will look at what you're going to do with water across the site. So that could be sort of roof water. Generally speaking, in shepherd's huts and things, it's very, very minimal, so you wouldn't have to worry too much. So that's your clean water. In terms of your foul water, you will have to just be able to show how you're going to deal with it. Composting toilets are acceptable to the council. So are things like sewage treatment plants, things like Clargestas and things like that. You just have to, so they will be interested. You just have to be able to, again, either on a plan or through sort of a text description, just be able to kind of explain. It only needs to be fairly simple, but explain how the toilets are going to work and where the waste is going to go, who's going to pick it up, how frequently, that sort of thing. So composting toilets are fine. As are sewage treatment plants and things. It's just a case of explaining it to the council.
Fab. And we've just got time for a couple more questions. Tom's asked a question in relation to large marquees. Can large marquees be left up all summer if only used for the 28 days or less?
Ooh, that is a really good question. I think that I would probably say not. Because you can't then use it for agriculture, and don't tell me you're going to put a sheep in there or something. But I would say that you are then excluding the agricultural use for the time that it is up. So I would say that you're changing the use for over 28 days. I suspect probably some smart aleck might come along and say there's a way around it. But especially in the case of a large white marquee, it's going to be quite noticeable as well. So it's not something that can be hidden. So I would suggest probably not, but it's a good question.
Very good question. And the final question tonight is from Zoe. Do you know roughly the likelihood of planning approval for a small glamping site, so a maximum of 3 pods in an area of outstanding natural beauty, and is it worth continuing?
Yeah, it adds it basically, the area of outstanding natural beauty makes it a higher bar. Things like small pods, we have been successful with small pods. I've got one at the moment which is for like some large white yurts, and they're insisting on it being yurts, even though we've suggested that might not be the best thing. So I'm a bit nervous about large white yurts. If we're talking about sort of small browny coloured pods that are wooden, they pretty well blend into the landscape. With the AONB, it is quite a high designation. It's quite a high bar to overcome. Councils are quite precious about the AONB. So what you have got to do is you just got to go over and above what you would normally have to do in terms of demonstrating to the council that there is either limited or negligible impact on the AONB in terms of visual impact, in terms of, sort of actually sort of any detriment to the landscape character, that sort of thing. And sometimes it might be better, or it may be prudent to get a couple of sort of independent reports. So you can get something called a landscape and visual impact assessment done by specialists, and they will basically kind of score the impact of your project, and then make an assessment of it independently against the AONB, and that can help reassure a planning officer that that it is going to be acceptable. Very much think about the design and think about the scale, but three smallish pods in an AONB, I think I'd be going for that. Yeah. Obviously, subject to not seeing the site or anything, but that wouldn't necessarily put me off it just by hearing that. No.
Fab. And I promise this is the last question. So in Shropshire, again, sorry, this is from Ian again. So in Shropshire, glamping pods are treated as caravans for planning purposes. Would I then need a local authority caravan site operating licence?
Oh, I'm a little bit out of my comfort zone, if I'm absolutely honest, Ian. Sorry. My kind of involvement tends to finish at about the planning. I don't know is the answer. I think if you've got planning permission, yeah, sorry for being thick on the last question. You'd have to perhaps maybe, if you've got the planning permission in place, then I would think that you could probably ask the question to the council without too many issues. Sorry for not being helpful on that one. If you want me to, I do know one of the guys that we work with the business farm, Ted. I don't know whether he's on, Rosie.
No, I don't think Ted is doing
No,
management.
we've got a chap that we do some work with, Ted, who does quite a lot with the caravan and camping clubs and so on, and he's pretty familiar with it. So, Ian, if you'd like us to, we're more than happy to ask Ted the question and come back to you.
Brilliant. Well, I think that we've used up most of your time, so thank you very much, Hannah. And thank you very much for everyone who's joined this evening. If you have got any other questions, feel free to ping Hannah an email. Her email address is still on the screen, I think. On the Business Barn, we do also have a forum on there. So if you wanted to sort of post your experiences, or you've got other questions that you would like Hannah or other planning consultants you work with to answer, then please do take a look at that. The forum's been designed to create sort of the interaction and conversation between everyone, so that's a great resource. We also have another glamping focused webinar coming up on the 2nd of July. Sarah Riley will be covering factors to consider when starting a glamping site, so not just planning but lots of other focuses. So if that's of interest, keep an eye out for that on the website. And again, we thank you very much for joining us, and we hope you enjoyed it, and have a great evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye everybody.
Bye.